So our second lesson this morning from the Gospel of Mark picks up just after last Sunday's Gospel ended. Recall that last week, Jesus has sent out his 12 disciples to teach, preach, cast out demons, and heal the sick. And apparently, that's exactly what they did. So successfully so that King Herod heard of it, as we just read. Now, this Herod is Herod Antipas, not to be confused with Herod the Great, his father, whom we meet in the Christmas story in the Gospel of Matthew. That's the Herod most of us think of when we think, King Herod. The Herodians were the client kings of the Roman Empire in this particular part of the world. They had no genetic claim to the throne of Judea, but instead they got themselves appointed as the rulers of portions of the province of Palestine. They were the middle managers in a vast Roman bureaucracy, basically. An arrangement that allowed the family of Herods to enjoy the wealth and the power of royalty, while always knowing in the back of their minds who was really in charge, that is, the emperor. When we come on the scene this morning, Herod the Great, the dad, is already dead, and his son has inherited a portion of his kingdom. Herod Antipas, it says, had visited his brother Philip having also inherited another portion of his dad's kingdom. And while he was visiting Philip, he fell in love with Philip's wife. Awkward. It gets worse, though, because Philip's wife, Herodias, apparently fell in love with him, and they decided they would go off together and marry one another just as soon as Herod could divorce his current wife. Awkward. What a guy. John the Baptizer, quite understandably, spoke out about this, okay? And it was a good thing that he did. Now, I imagine John the Baptist was also speaking out against a number of injustices which characterized Herod's rule. But the fact that he kind of latched on to the unsavoriness of Herod's new marriage was what really, really frustrated Herod's wife. Now, we're told that even though Herodias held a grudge against John, Herod himself seemed to like John. He found John kind of entertaining, at the least. It says he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. That's me on several days of the week. I'm often perplexed by people, but I like to listen to them. And that's how Herod felt about John. So when Herod's wife would fume and rave over what John had been saying about them in the press, basically, Herod, dazzled by John's rhetoric and perhaps even compelled by his holiness, couldn't bring himself to execute John, even though that's what his wife would have preferred. So he had him imprisoned instead. Now I want for you to put yourself in Herod's banquet room where our gospel lesson this morning starts. It's the world's most sinister birthday party. All of Herod's administrators and courtiers, his friends, are there. And just as soon as the candles are out on the proverbial cake, Herod's stepdaughter, who confusingly in this version of the story has the same name as her mother, Herodias. There are two different Herodiases, okay? And this is his daughter, comes out and dances for her father and his guests. They are, shall we say, charmed by her. Okay, the story is not safe for work. Let's just leave it at that. Something odd is going on in this courtroom. And Herod, swept up in the moment, probably a little tipsy and showing off in front of his friends, makes that famous promise to give his stepdaughter anything she wants, even if it's a portion of his kingdom. So daughter Herodias goes back to Mama Herodias and says, "What should I ask for?" And Mama Herodias says, "Ask your daddy for the head of John the Baptist." And the trap is sprung. The king was deeply grieved, Mark tells us, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. This little phrase, out of regard for the guests, is what interests me. See, it's out of Herod's desire to save face, to look good in front of his courtiers and so-called friends, that he executes John. Not because he believes it's the right thing to do. When we read this story, I imagine most of us want to identify with John. He's clearly the only sympathetic character in the whole thing. The one who patiently and bravely tells the truth about Herod's life and his rule and about the rod of injustice that lies at its heart. That's a sermon worth preaching, but it's not mine this morning. Partly because I worry it's too quick and easy a way for us out of Herod's dining room. See, I want to ask you this morning, are you a little bit like Herod? I am.